In this video I'm going to be taking a look at the entire Baldur's Gate series, including the new content from developer Beamdog, who recently rehabilitated the whole series for modern systems and added a lot of their own stuff, including a whole new 30-hour campaign right in the middle. We're going to be looking at all of it, how the old stuff works now, how the new stuff works with what they released way back then, and everything in between. It's also going to take a really long time. There's a timestamp table of contents at the bottom to jump around or come back to it after you put it down.
There is no electronic series that has captured the massive scope of adventure that tabletop Dungeons & Dragons is capable of so comprehensively as Baldur's Gate. There are plenty of franchises and series with a grander presentation and tighter plotting, even within the BioWare catalog, but none of them let you experience a story that takes your character from childhood to godhood in a way that's mechanically and narratively seamless. Your actions shape the fabric of a setting that spans far beyond the game itself. It's drawn from dozens of novels and tabletop nodules. It's a setting with a deep and complex mythology already in place before the game even starts. The success of Baldur's Gate as a series hinges not on how well-designed a game it is, but on how it blurs the lines between fantasy novel, tabletop role-playing, and digital systems. Sometimes this mix is awkward, but the sheer ambition and craft of the thing is unparalleled almost 20 years later. A new developer, Beamdog, not only restored the BioWare software to run with increased functionality on PC and now on tablets in the enhanced edition of the game, but they also added their new content to every title, even going so far as to make a massive expansion to the first game that's as large as Throne of Bhaal was for the second. They've kept this series alive and kicking long after the moment passed where these games made the most sense as a retail product. But very few players have actually gone back and revisited the entire span of the Baldur's Gate experience, new and old content alike. According to Steam achievements, 10% of Baldur's Gate 1 players have made it out of the opening location, which shrinks down to 1.3% of players who have actually finished the enhanced edition. About 0.5% of players have gone on to finish the new expansion, Siege of Dragonspear. For the second game, the numbers are even smaller. 5% of players have left the introductory dungeon, and 0.4% of players have gone all the way to the end of Throne of Bhaal. So, if Baldur's Gate is such an amazing experience, like critics and older RPG fans say it is, why are so few new players able to actually get into the experience? Those percentages are taken from people who own the game on Steam. Far more have bought the game than ever meaningfully played it, by more than a 10-to-1 ratio. Untangling the reasons behind this disparity, between its high reputation and its low impact in its newly remastered form, is a journey that takes almost as long as the games themselves. Role-playing games have recently begun coming back around to the design sensibilities of Baldur's Gate, but the games themselves are truly of a previous era in a way that's hard to pin down. It's not just the rule set. The culture of fantasy, of how high adventure is portrayed and crafted and consumed, has changed. Our expectations have changed. And yet, Baldur's Gate has barely changed at all since 1998. No matter how many years pass in the real world, your adventure always begins the same, with the player assuming the role of a young and naive ward of Candlekeep, protected by the mage Gorion all your life from the things to come. The way Baldur's Gate opens is critical to the whole experience, and key to the player's emotional investment in the grand arc of their ultimate destiny. To start humble is important. Candlekeep is small but friendly. You're surrounded by friends and mentors, folks whose power would appear insignificant later on in the game, but who seem at the start to be so much older and wiser than you. You and your childhood friend Imowen are orphan wards under the care of Gorion. Things are happening beyond either of your control, though, and you must leave together as home may no longer be safe. You're an innocent. You've never killed a man, you've never looted a corpse, you've never earned a coin off the blood of another. You know nothing of yourself save the peace and freedom of quiet childhood. Considering the tide of murder that washes in alongside your destiny, this is a remarkable start. The idea of home and history, of your character having been part of the world but having seen little of it so far, grounds the player immediately. It's quiet, it's pastoral, it's very different from what comes afterwards. Your origin is important in Baldur's Gate, and you'll circle back around to it time and time again over the course of your journey. Gorion and Imowen are family, but when you begin your journey, you're ambushed by a figure named Sarevok. He kills Gorion, and you barely escape. The gates of Candlekeep are closed to you with him dead. Imowen is all you have left, and home is permanently behind you at the start of the game. From now on, you're no one's ward. You're an adventurer now. You have nothing to lose and nowhere to go but forward. Before all this, your first optional task was to go and kill rats in the basement for 1 experience point apiece. As cliché as it is, there's something powerfully charming about this. You're an absolute beginner at adventuring. You can barely withstand a single blow from a sword, and experience comes slowly in Baldur's Gate. By the end of the entire first game and the expansions, you can't really make it past level 9. There's not enough experience points in all the monsters and all the quests. Every orc, every goblin, every lowly rat is a meaningful stepping stone on your adventure, and you'll never truly become a powerhouse of combat or magic. It's a low-level adventure, in a way that digital role-playing games almost never solely focus on anymore. Although it is a typical special destiny plot and a typical rise to power for your character, it happens slower than any modern game would dare, much to its own benefit. Each stage of growth, as a character in the narrative and as a character on the sheet, is distinctive, lasting long enough to feel like an era of your character and not a session of play. It feels natural, or more natural than most games. Typically, a computer role-playing game makes you feel like a badass by the halfway mark. Baldur's Gate doesn't let you become overpowered until more than halfway through the next game in the series. And you wouldn't feel it half as deeply if you didn't have such a strong sense of your character's roots as a clumsy amateur. What's especially remarkable is that Baldur's Gate, the original, has an open world of a quality and depth that wouldn't really be seen again in computer role-playing games until 3D got big, with Morrowind and World of Warcraft in the mid-2000s. There are dozens and dozens of optional outdoor areas, and with the addition of content from the 1999 Tales of the Sword Coast expansion, there's a meaty chunk of large side dungeons as well. All of it freeform, all of it optional. The incredibly low level cap and the excruciating slowness of leveling is what makes this arrangement possible and manageable. Where a modern RPG like Skyrim would use level scaling to make the game's progression nonlinear, Baldur's Gate simply limits its monsters and loot to a sliver of AD&D's broader scope, the levels 1 through 7. That's the way the tabletop game was meant to be experienced as well, and why it didn't seem like a strange design choice at the time. Adventures, also called modules, all had a particular kind of level spread for players to be in for it to work right. And you weren't meant to gain more than a level or two per adventure, certainly not more than one per evening of play. Part of this is social, to allow players who may have missed a session to stay in the level range of others in the party and continue the journey next week when they didn't have to be at work or whatever the obligation was. Part of it is to identify the amount of relative peril you'll be facing, powerful characters versus overwhelming challenges, or fragile amateurs fighting the odds and winning smaller struggles. The tone and rhythm of Dungeons & Dragons changes with different character levels. This has always been one of the fun things about the tabletop experience, the relatively self-contained nature of each module, and the way you'd reuse the same character for harder and harder modules. If you really played from level 1 to 20 with the same group, it would take months of play, dozens of modules. But during that time, you would experience your friendships two ways, as regular friends playing a game together over and over again, and as your characters who would develop an intricate past with one another as adventures pile up behind them. So no one really batted an eye in 1998 that you only got 6 or 7 levels out of a 100-hour game. It was just like real Dungeons & Dragons that way, and also like tabletop Dungeons & Dragons. If the Dungeon Master cannot command the player's attention and curiosity, they inevitably wander off into a myriad of unexpected distractions. Baldur's Gate has much more side content than primary content. Its developer, Black Isle, fundamentally understood that the call of adventure is a strange and haphazard one, and attempting to force the player to do anything at all runs counter to the spirit of Dungeons & Dragons. So Baldur's Gate presents the player with a vast fantasy wilderness, allows the plot to unravel slowly enough to invite a thorough exploration. And then that exploration begins pretty much instantaneously. You and Imoen set out, and the wheels of prophecy begin to turn. Baldur's Gate is not designed like a modern digital role-playing game at all. It isn't exactly a computer game at heart. It's an automated dungeon master. The game being played is still Dungeons & Dragons. The software of Baldur's Gate, the program, is just the technological and artistic framework by which you can play Dungeons & Dragons as a solitary experience. Everything about it, its hopeless and frustrating mechanical complexity, its detailed hand-pixelated backgrounds, its tactical turn-based combat, its branching dialogue trees and emphasis on choice, is an act of translation from one medium to another. It is an act of digitizing the complex, unpredictable, deeply social experience of Dungeons & Dragons in a way that's completely comprehensive. It seeks to mimic the emotions of D&D, the sense of curiosity and discovery, of friendship and danger, that previously required a room full of friends and whole evenings of time. That's the real genius of the game. Few people are able to play tabletop RPGs. It's hard to find a group of willing friends, and even if you've got one, it becomes increasingly hard to coordinate everyone's free time as people get older and the responsibilities of the real world accumulate. To take the special kind of slow-burning, highly social, technically complex game experience that Dungeons & Dragons is about, and automate every single role besides that of a single player to be picked up and put down at leisure as time and schedule allows, is a tall order. BioWare had a tremendous challenge before them if they wanted to make a game that was truly faithful to a tabletop experience. Modern role-playing games provide wonderful experiences that make incredible use of the medium of video games, but they fail to recapture the magic of Baldur's Gate, first and foremost because they are trying to be a video game, and a video game only, because they don't seek to translate, mimic, and automate the tabletop experience the way that Black Isle and BioWare did in the early days. It's evident in the systems. A scene is revealed to you as you advance, like it would be described to you by the Dungeon Master. Everything is accomplished with dice rolls. Weapon damage is still listed by the number and type of dice being rolled. On regular and higher difficulties, even hit point gain is randomized with a dice roll. The advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set is very complicated and very archaic, but in a tabletop setting it makes more sense. Combat is meant to be slow. Everyone talks it through, and each encounter is dangerous. A single climactic combat could take half the night in a tabletop setting, but the tactical options open to the player are limited only by their imagination. The spells in the game are reflective of this. There are many more spells than situations where they would be called for in Baldur's Gate, but the system is meant to work with human imagination instead of predefined code. They could have easily made a system that was better suited to the limitations of a video game. That's what happened to Fallout, for example. It was originally intended to use GURPS, another complicated tabletop rule set. Black Isle ditched it and made their own, one more tailored to the game. But on release, the point of Baldur's Gate was not so much that it was a new computer role-playing game, but that it was, specifically and deliberately, the one game to finally provide an authentic, single-player, advanced D&D experience. There's one cardinal sin in tabletop role-playing that Baldur's Gate commits that allows it to elegantly one-up most other campaigns in D&D history. It makes the story about just one player in particular, Player 1. It's a special destiny plot. You just can't do that in an in-person group because it's neither fun nor fair for one character to play the starring role. Baldur's Gate's special destiny plotline is cliché, considering that the entire BioWare role-playing catalog uses them, right up through Dragon Age Inquisition. But to have that kind of plot for a 6-person AD&D campaign in the late 90s is breaking a little bit of a storytelling taboo for the setting. The challenge of making it work lies, at least somewhat, in how convincingly automated the 5 digital party members are. Baldur's Gate 2 does a lot more with the supporting cast than the first game. Here at the beginning, the companions are a little broadly drawn, a little subdued. They'll chime in occasionally in important conversations, but not nearly as much as later titles. There's a small fidelity to the tabletop experience with that, though. Typically, although every player does come up with a backstory, you don't get too carried away with it. If you can put it on a single sheet of paper, that's usually about right. Conversations between party members in a tabletop setting are almost always focused on the present and not the past, what the party wants to do and not improvisational memory. There's such an enormous amount of ad-libbing to be done if you've got a complicated backstory that most people just stick to what's going on right now. In terms of AD&D as a game, in terms of systems and rules beyond the narrative, backstory has little impact. Companions are important for how well you want to balance your party mechanically, and keeping the party more acquaintances than friends helps with that in Baldur's Gate. You'll meet characters who are important to the plot and have important things to tell you, like Khalid and Jaheira, a harper couple that Gorion has to look after you. But after they help steer you in the right direction, you won't miss much if you have to say, for example, "Sorry guys, there's only room for one druid in the party, and that's me." There are a pretty large number of NPCs available, and a whole array of classes and alignments. When you play on the lower difficulties, there's a tendency to keep the party limited to characters who are especially noteworthy or fun in the plot, to arrange your party for sentimental reasons and not mechanical ones. But because their contributions to conversations are relatively minor, players on higher difficulties who take the plunge and arrange their party by mechanical necessity don't actually miss out on any meaningful plot. Companions who are extremely different in alignment will argue with each other in the player, making the kinds of haphazard parties higher difficulties require a little more lively than an all-good-guy party anyway. The alignment system is one of the most well-considered features of Dungeons & Dragons, a way of mechanically expressing and tracking the moral inclinations of a character. There are spells like Know Alignment or Detect Evil that allow you to know the temperament of a character before even conversing with them. Dungeons & Dragons is a collision of the emotional and ethical internal lives of fantasy characters with tactical and mechanical systems of rules and numeric variables, to make the outcomes of that character's dilemmas unpredictable. We've been playing games like that for a long time now. It doesn't reflect a hurt on how peculiar an experience it is, how artistically strange tabletop role-playing is, sitting square at the intersection of storytelling, performance, and the uncaring roll of the dice. It's the relative cruelty and complexity of AD&D as a rule set that I think is at the root of why modern players have an overwhelming tendency to put this game down and never return to it. Everything is so genuinely dangerous, not just for low-level characters either. The threats escalate right alongside any power gained. Companions, even if you really like them, are in danger of being totally annihilated and removed from the game entirely at almost any time. When a companion dies, they drop everything in their inventory and must be brought back to life with either a high-level spell or taken to a priest. Unless you're disintegrated, turned to stone, or banished to an alternate plane of existence, in which case you'll suffer a permanent, irreversible death. A lot of this is, again, because it was meant to be a social, spoken, out-loud thing. The death of a player in a tabletop setting is a crisis and a quest. The others must band together so that everyone present can continue to participate in the story, and the Dungeon Master can usually be persuaded to be forgiving about a death from an unlucky dice roll or an absent-minded combat decision. Only these permanent deaths force a player to roll a whole new character. They suck. It sucks when it happens to you. But without them, without the threat of absolute and total failure, there would be a lot less tension. In person, this is great. If you put a year into a character and they get eaten by an enormous demon and digested, the whole party mourns for it. It's the end of a performance and the end of an emotional investment. And the discretion of whether to apply that level of peril is left to the Dungeon Master, who can think to themselves, well, Paul's had kind of a rough week, so this mage is going to cast Time Stop, then Fireball, instead of going straight to Imprisonment. An automated Dungeon Master will never do anything less than its absolute best to kill everybody at all times. It is fundamentally uncaring, in a way that makes AD&D more of an awkward fit for a game. So many of its harshest rules are meant to be applied with human discretion. In the game, Imoen is a childhood friend and later a very important character. But if she gets hit with a disintegration, it doesn't matter. She's removed from the story permanently. Same with everyone else, and that's another reason for how casual the player's relationships with party members are in this first title. They can die, permanently, at a moment's notice, and based entirely off of genuinely random elements for the most part, the right collision of big monster and bad luck. There's one wilderness region that's nothing but basilisks as far as the eye can see, and their primary attack is to attempt to turn people in your party to stone, removing them from the game until a reversal spell is found. There's only one remedy besides reloading your game: Story Mode. Introduced in the Enhanced Edition, Story Mode makes your characters invulnerable to permadeath and regular death both. It eliminates carry weight, and it raises everyone's strength to make them more likely to hit in combat. It basically suspends the consequences of the entire AD&D rule set. And if I didn't have it, I'm not so certain I would have played the series from start to finish again either. Here's the absolute truth of the matter. As a PC game, the combat in Baldur's Gate, especially the first one while everyone's low level, is a massively time-consuming affair that begins with the meticulous placement of party members and ends with those characters standing in one place, swinging and missing, over and over, until enough swings actually connect for someone to die. Little is based off of player skill outside of tactical placement, spell use, and inventory management. The dice control the combat. The dice are a tremendous bore. You get into hundreds upon hundreds of violent encounters in Baldur's Gate. Every last one is a chore. Now, there's plenty of players for whom a chore is a challenge, who think that THAC0 is sensible, but THAC0 is pretty emblematic of everything that people don't like about AD&D, the second edition of D&D rules. It stands for 2-hit armor class 0. When you're rolling to hit, you take your THAC0 and subtract the opponent's armor class, and then roll that number or above. So if you've got a THAC0 of 15, which is pretty great, and your opponent has an armor class of 3, which is pretty great as well, you'd have to get 12 or above to hit on a 20-sided dice. The lower your armor class, the better. The higher your THAC0, the better. To call this counterintuitive is underselling the experience a lot. Trying to make your armor class as low as possible is bizarre. This isn't golf. Trying to get a dragon in 1 is not satisfying. THAC0 is wacko, and I want no part of it. It is the single greatest obstacle standing in between a newcomer to the series and actually enjoying the series, feeling lost in trying to understand how something as fundamental as attack and defense is calculated. As much as it's easy to criticize games like Dragon Age for being excessively simplified, Baldur's Gate gives the strong impression that overshooting the mark on mechanical complexity is just as problematic in how it makes the player aware of the artificiality and triviality of the game experience. When a game is too easy, you're just smashing buttons to continue. When it's too complicated, you have no idea what buttons you're even supposed to press to continue. Everything I truly love about this game is in the writing, in the art, in the way it draws from the incredible wealth of background information available and commonly shared by Forgotten Realms enthusiasts. Story mode does make the game too easy. I'll freely admit, you barely interact with the rule set, and your success is guaranteed. But if my alternative is having my favorite characters turned to stone and needing to learn a several hundred-page rule set that I will never ever use outside late 90s BioWare titles, I will choose it every time over the impenetrable abrasiveness of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in its natural form. Although you can't hold a conversation with an automated dungeon master, the difficulty slider comes close. If you actually do love AD&D and want more, you can make it even harder than standard AD&D rules, upping enemy health while decreasing your damage. As you go down the scale, more and more standard features and rules, like rolling dice for hit point gain when you level up, are subtracted until finally you end up at story mode at the bottom. Baldur's Gate is already more like a Forgotten Realms novel than a campaign because it's a solitary experience. You can bookmark your place and pick it back up again at your leisure. Story mode transitions the game from simulated AD&D to interactive Forgotten Realms fiction. I know some people are bristling at the idea. I can guarantee you there are just as many others, thinking about the hundreds of hours it takes to play the series, who could almost tear up with joy, knowing that there's a way to essentially fast-forward through dozens of hours of characters standing in place, failing to hit one another. Saying that Baldur's Gate in story mode is interactive Forgotten Realms fiction is no criticism either. Some of my favorite fantasy titles of all time have used the setting. Ed Greenwood, who has a kind of Mary Sue-like presence within the setting as the wise, crafty, outrageously powerful wizard Elminster, came up with the whole thing way back in 1967. The first union between the Forgotten Realms setting and Dungeons & Dragons came later, in 1987, but it blossomed hugely afterwards. There are around 76 novels using the setting, many by Greenwood himself, but also by many other notable authors like R.A. Salvatore. Beginning with 1988's Pool of Radiance, there are also 50 distinct video game adventures using the setting, including the 5 components of the Baldur's Gate series. We are so used to games that rely on an entirely proprietary fictional universe like Dragon Age or the Elder Scrolls, that it's easy to miss how significant it is that Baldur's Gate was part of this massively detailed and deep setting right from the get-go. This is a world where the mystical elements, the gods and goddesses and divine in-betweeners, are not only real, but important. All 9 points of the moral alignment compass, including the difficult-to-play true neutral, have a divine representative. They have their own plane of existence that you could wind up in when you die. Not just heaven, not just hell, not just purgatory, but several sorts of each, depending on how you've approached your morality. It's a pantheon that's tailored with extreme care to work on a narrative level, in a way that's complementary to the mechanical systems. This is a big deal. Dragon Age is more modern, with its skepticism of whether gods are anything more than powerful figures who make bad choices. That skepticism also makes its mythology less vibrant and useful in the setting. So when the game begins, and Elminster shows up and asks cryptic questions, and when it's later suggested that Baal, the now-dead Lord of Murder who ruled from the chaotic evil plane of the infinite abyss, is actually your dad, these don't happen to be framed as huge deals. There's an implicit assumption that the player already knows how huge a deal they are. So they're presented with a light-handedness that's uncommon in games today. It is not necessary to be familiar with Forgotten Realms to enjoy Baldur's Gate, but it helps enormously, and it lets a player pick up on some of the more subtle elements of the game's world-building, which suggest connections to the larger mythology and creative universe without being tremendously explicit. At least until later on. But Baldur's Gate doesn't spend much time explaining itself to the player on account of it. When you run across a priest of Cyric, for example, you're not given an option to say, "Hold a moment, sir, and explain your entire religion to me." You're supposed to already be thinking, "Oh no, not these assholes." Plus, cameos from important Forgotten Realms characters like Volo, Drizzt Do'Urden, and many others feel especially fun. You know them from the books, but here they are, doing their own thing, out and about, in a living, real-time world. The more you play, the clearer it is that Baldur's Gate is not solely successful as a game and only a game, but because it's a crossroads between wholly different ways of experiencing and participating in fantasy storytelling. The plot itself is even tailored to tackle a video game problem that modern game critics came up with an awkwardly fancy name for: ludonarrative dissonance. I usually don't use the phrase because it absolutely does sound obnoxious, but Baldur's Gate engages with the common complaints addressed by the phenomenon so directly that there's no real way around it this time. The idea behind ludonarrative dissonance is that the way a character positions themselves in plot and dialogue is often wildly at odds with their actions in the gameplay. This phrase got popularized around when BioShock Infinite came out because that game had a protagonist who loathed his own violence, but gameplay that emphasized the fun of those same violent acts. So consider, you're making a character on the good spectrum, say lawful good like a paladin or neutral good like a cleric of Lathander. By the time you finish the Baldur's Gate series, you'll have killed thousands of things, many of them rational creatures who might have been talked down. This is the way the game works. It's fundamentally, intractably combat-oriented just for the basic fact of having such an open world to adventure in with so much side content. Adventuring is violent, full stop. A good dungeon master can offer a lot of opportunities for non-violence. However, a dungeon master has their entire imagination at their disposal. An automated dungeon master does not. It has a script in one hand and a sword in the other. It has no imaginative capacity to invent, and the script cannot be altered by choices outside of the ones already accommodated by the writers. If you add it all up, you're killing a lot more creatures than is sane or reasonable for anyone, even a tabletop character. A tabletop campaign wouldn't have the time to kill half the things you do in this game, by virtue of how slow combat is when everyone has to verbally explain themselves every round. Rather than ignoring it, or waffling on the morality of it, which is usually what happens with that sort of disconnect, it's solved and made compelling by introducing a divine dilemma into the equation. Your character, however good they want to be, is the child of the former god of murder. It's in your blood. Death literally runs through your veins. If you're playing a character on the evil spectrum, this is great. It explains why you're so unbelievably skilled at cruelties and aggressions. If you're good, though, then you're fighting against your nature the entire time. For an automated dungeon master, violence is the default response. You have to be very clever within the systems of spells and dialogue to avoid the default violence. This isn't just a technical limitation of the game as a piece of software, though. Framing it this way makes the entire process a dilemma for your character. You want to do good, but you get sucked into violence everywhere you go anyway. It's genius. It throws the plot over the potential disconnect like a well-worn blanket, snug and cozy where it was bare before. Since you don't know for sure if that's the case until the very end of the game, it can't be used as an excuse for your actions either. It's a revelatory explanation, where either your game-long dilemma about violence is given divine definition, or else your rise to power is explained as something that was unique to the player. Mostly unique, anyway. There are other Ballspawn. Sarevok is one, and while he is the villain of the story, his presence is kind of minimal in the overall experience of Baldur's Gate. The scope of the series is so large, though, that you actually do get time to get to know him very well. In Throne of Bhaal, the massive expansion for the second game. In Baldur's Gate 1, the momentum of the plot comes secondary to the pleasures of aimless adventure. The original expansion for the game, Tales from the Sword Coast, demonstrates this emphasis pretty well. Unlike the other expansions, it adds no new plot and no new territory, although it does feature an artifact, Soul Taker, that Beamdog would use as a plot device in its own expansion, making the content more significant after the fact. What there is a small town, Olgoth's Beard, and 3 new adventures based out of there. There's a pretty good 2-hour quest to an island of werewolves in search of some relics from the adventurer for whom Baldur's Gate is named. It's got some cleverly executed, if predictable, twists, and is surprisingly hefty in the dialogue department. Then there's also a wizard's prison, where you teleport in and can't teleport out before solving the mystery and defeating a labyrinth full of crazed magicians, which feels like an interesting little bit of thematic foreshadowing for Spellhold in the next game. Then there's the star of the show, Durlag's Tower. There's a lot of very traditional, tabletop module-inspired Dungeons & Dragons quests in this game, none quite as traditional or quite as total an experience as Durlag's Tower. It's a module within a module, and by far the most outrageously difficult part of Baldur's Gate. While on a guided tour of the tower ruins, a demon from below kills the guide and everyone else. Are you adventurous enough to delve into the unplundered lower levels of the tower and defeat the ancient evil? Every single room is filled with traps, treasure, difficult monsters. Like Dungeons & Dragons was meant to be from the very first. It is the purest mechanical distillation of the game, going slowly and carefully room by room, solving puzzles, collecting loot, slaying evil. You need a good balance of characters in your party to survive, especially the climactic confrontation, which pushes your low-level party to the limits, unless you're on story mode, and then you're just missing out. 90% of the entire Baldur's Gate series is pretty great on story mode. This is part of the 10% that isn't. Durlag's Tower is a genuinely beautiful little piece of dungeoneering. It's clearly meant to put people deeply familiar with the advanced parts of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons through their paces, give them something to sink their min-maxing teeth into. The story here is that you, the player, were able to beat it. A part of me wishes I liked and understood AD&D rules well enough to beat it properly, with the difficulty intact, but not a large enough part to actually do so. Durlag's Tower is the mechanical climax of the game, the hardest thing you can do. The narrative climax happens a little messier, with one of the more awkwardly paced third acts in the BioWare catalog. The sense of urgency surrounding the primary plot is, for most of the game, non-existent. You're following vague leads to individual adventures, and while there is a hidden hand behind the troubles plaguing the Sword Coast, there's no sense that you shouldn't go a week out of your way to deliver a journal or rescue a witch from gnolls. Then, you finally get to the actual city of Baldur's Gate, and all that changes. The transition from rural to urban adventuring is rough on the pacing. All of a sudden, you're confronted with the densest concentration of characters and locations in the game when you're almost done with it. The plot speeds up, and you have to choose between supporting the Flaming Fist, the mercenary band who watches over the city, and Sarevok's Shadow Organization. If you're good, you want to stop Sarevok and support the common good. If you're evil, you want to rise high enough in the ranks to usurp the organization right from under his nose. Either way, you have a lot to do, and the city is absolutely massive. Yet it's slightly sparse on quests. All this space, and the majority of it, feels unused. Residences, mainly, which is good for thieves, but bad for an impatient player. The city is mostly just a tremendous detailed background that the final confrontations of the game hinge on. You make an impression, you start to gain a reputation as a champion of the city or a new power within it, and then you go home. A lead sends you back to Candlekeep right before the climax, and it's quite a homecoming. You have grown stronger and more dangerous than any of the figures who helped you through your early steps. Your first delivered scroll, your first rat-filled basement. Candlekeep was a place of peace and refuge your whole pre-adventuring life. When you encounter your enemies within, do you violate the peace of Candlekeep? Either you choose to murder Sarevok's lackeys, or else you're framed for it. Either way, the people who once looked at you as family now look at you like a murderer. Worse, if they know the truth, that murder is all you were really destined to be in the first place. Your character has dreams about their divine destiny, dreams about blood and anger and the satisfactions of both. Some BioWare titles, like Knights of the Old Republic, can be a little more engaging as an evil character. Baldur's Gate, though, assumes that most people are playing as good, and makes the narrative struggle much more engaging for those players on account of it. You'll do bad deeds and be blamed for bad things. Can you handle these accusations and temptations with grace? Paladins can no longer level up in their class if they stray from the lawful good alignment. To stay their course, they have to overcome enemies from both within and without, with a dedication that most games would not really require from a player. Even if you're not playing such a goody two-shoes, the arc is remarkable. From the beginning of the game to the end, in your time away from home, you have lost your innocence and become a child of murder, whether you like it or not. Being the first part of a larger series also causes some problems for the impact of the first game's climax because it's so very obviously in the middle of the story. The big revelation is more of a big confirmation. The confrontation with Sarevok doesn't really feel like the end of anything. It feels like the part where the story finally picks up urgency and momentum. At the beginning of the game, there's home and family, Candlekeep, Gorion, Imawin. At the end of the game, it's family again, but a different sort. Bhaal, your long-dead, supremely evil father, has gifts to pass down to you. Sarevok took those gifts, became a worthy heir to the throne of murder. Yet, undeniably, you're the better murderer. No matter what alignment your character, what your convictions are, there's always going to be the lingering possibility that your destiny is inescapable. Sarevok was your half-brother, but you're the favored one. So now here you are, the hero of Baldur's Gate, the one who finally brought stability back to the Sword Coast, but you've got an unresolved destiny and a shameful secret. Long before Mass Effect, Baldur's Gate 2 would let you import your character from the first game and continue playing exactly where you left off, which was amazing. Less amazing was how the second game began, unraveling the triumphs of the first game and killing off several important companions in the opening exposition and introductory dungeon. It felt incredibly abrupt. The end of the first game leaves the player with many interesting questions, and the second game smacks you right away with a complete change of location, tonality, and plot focus. For the entire history of the Baldur's Gate franchise, the transition between these games has been the jankiest bit. It's such a huge gap that Beamdog, the new developer who made the Enhanced Edition, fit a whole new 20 to 30 hour campaign in the narrative vacuum. It's brand new, from 2016, but using the old engine and rule set. Like Throne of Bhaal, it begins immediately after the main game's campaign and functions as a singular campaign in its own right. Beamdog spent years on it. It's an incredible devotional act to the series, not only preserving the original for modern operating systems, but making the experience even larger, narratively stronger. At least, that's the ambition. Is it even possible for an 18-year-after-the-fact expansion to blend into a creative work by an entirely different, long-broken-up development house? There's no simple answer for Siege of Dragonspear. It is both a brilliant piece of connective tissue between two previously divided experiences and a failure to live up to the vibrancy of the Black Isle BioWare originals. Siege comes so close to being exactly what fans wanted, but to see why it wasn't, we have to go back to the Enhanced Edition's new content by Beamdog. Their additions are unbelievably obvious, and they stand out from all the other companions for a number of reasons, the most obvious of which is how much of their dialogue is voiced. Badly. When you're hanging out with friends in a tabletop setting, it's easy to be forgiving of bad dialogue and bad accents. They're your friends, and you can always ask them to tone it down a notch if they're really getting under your skin. In Baldur's Gate, throughout the original scripts, there was a lot of clunky dialogue. They're not perfect games, but the dialogue and characterization was so strongly tied to the tonality of the Forgotten Realms novels that the overall impression is still very strong. The bad writing in Black Isle's content is mostly flat writing, characters with not enough detail, dialogue that is not expressive or runs in circles. So it doesn't really track in how people remember the game. Just like the combat, there are so many swings and misses that you only end up recounting the memorable triumphs. Beamdog suffers a wholly different problem. Their enthusiasm for the games and the setting is so high and so high energy that they overshoot it. Their characters are over-detailed, typecast, and obnoxiously earnest. There's no parity with the original companions. The originals would chime in, certainly, but they didn't have the whirlwinds of personal drama surrounding them that the Beamdog characters do. What's going on is that Baldur's Gate comes from a time before BioWare RPGs were quite so huge of personality. These are the games that do not yet fit the later mold, the tentative and experimental first steps towards a defined format. Beamdog is attempting to be faithful to old BioWare by borrowing the tropes of new BioWare, and all it does is show how wholly different the approach has become. Now that full voice has become the standard, each character is expensive to put on screen, so they demand attentive detail, long backstories revealed slowly, multiple side quests, personal conflicts that only the player can help them resolve. Baldur's Gate 2 starts playing around with some of that stuff, but not quite yet with the first game. So when you meet Nira and immediately get pulled into a conflict she has with the Red Wizards of Thay, and every other line of dialogue has actual voice work narrating it, her outsider status in the series is clear. If Nira was a dynamic character, it would be fine to merely stand out as new, but she's a massive cliché, a scatterbrained wild mage who balances cute innocence with magic power. Like if you traced out Willow's character from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but made sure she was as dislikable as Dawn. Dorn Ilkhan's the same way. He's an evil guy. He does evil stuff. Evilly. But because he's a big important new companion, you have to kill him several times over the course of the different games to get it to stick if you're playing hardline good. There's an assumption with a lot of Beamdog's content that since it's new, you should not be able to skip it easily. Which might have worked if the design of the original content didn't have so much respect for the player's ability to say no to damn near anything. The most powerful parallel I can draw between Beamdog and Black Isle is that of a new tabletop group getting the hang of high fantasy, and the old guard who knows how to do it with nuance. The biggest difference between the two groups is knowing how to recognize cliché. The more invested you are in fantasy pop culture, the more you've consumed, the more obvious the most common tropes will become. Fantasy is very insular in a lot of ways and tends to repeat itself. Dragon Age's rejections and subversions of traditional fantasy mythology was one of the things that really helped it to stand out, after all. Being as tied to the Forgotten Realms novels and extended universe as the first game is, assuming familiarity on the player's part with the setting in different creative formats, meant that its audience was going to pick up on most clichés immediately. Baldur's Gate doesn't avoid them, it uses them playfully, knowingly. Naturally, your first task is to kill rats in the basement. What else could it have possibly been? Of course this boy wants his lost puppy, but suppose it's a demon and not a boy. Minsk embodies every cliché of the well-meaning adventurer, but the running joke is that bystanders think that Minsk is completely crazy. Beamdog's characters don't have subversions or joking twists that deflate these clichés. They are overwhelmingly, infuriatingly sincere and straightforward. Even the background characters. Like, there's a cool artifact called the Spectacle of Spectacle. They allow you to see creatures trapped between the planes and pull them through. You can only use it 3 times, but there's about 9 creatures that you can use it on. It's a cool quest. But it's given to you by a character who says everything in an, "Oh, hey dude," stoner voice. The joke hasn't even been relevant in years. Marijuana's legal down the whole West Coast. We all smoke pot out here. None of us sound like that. That stock character can finally be put out to pasture. Yet, here he is. At times, Siege of Dragonspear goes so far for a punchline that it shatters the whole suspension of disbelief. There's jokes in the originals, tons of jokes, and some characters like the Observer who are purely comedic, but never does it feel like something was added for the absolute sole purpose of getting a cheap laugh. Here, there's a lot that's useless without a guffaw at the end, and a lot of that humor is both topical and recent, which makes a big difference. Hearing jokes about things that happened in pop culture a decade or more after Baldur's Gate came out while in Baldur's Gate is odd. Hearing jokes about dumb internet memes pushes it way over the line into pure obnoxiousness. Then there's stuff that's very self-consciously wants to be serious and make commentary on some of the cliches that the script otherwise embraces. Take Baldur and the Goblin Shamaness, for example. Baldur, another Beamdog character from a combat-centric expansion module called the Black Pits, has this goblin in a fighting pit. The goblin breaks out and tells Baldur exactly what she thinks of his imprisonment. It's a little vignette about not making assumptions based on sex and based on race, which is a fine moral. And it's a fine moral that appears right next to low-effort jokes and characters that behave literally exactly as you would expect them to from start to finish based off of cliches and first impressions. If you want to make a point about not trusting assumptions, why reward the assumptions made about other characters elsewhere in the script? Is there any player familiar with the content that didn't expect the mage Heffernan to be a double-crosser? He's a snooty, condescending red wizard with long blonde hair. The originals had one of those too, but they used Edwin for comedy relief and not a climactic plot twist. There's a lot to criticize in how Beamdog deals with characterization and dialogue, which is why it's so impossibly frustrating that a pack of assholes turned the entire conversation about Siege of Dragonspear's quality into an argument about the legitimacy of one of its most absolutely inconsequential, tangential characters. She's a priest of Tempest named Mazena, and if you ask her about her name, she says this.
When I was born, my parents thought me a boy and raised me as such. In time, we all came to understand I was truly a woman. I created my new name from syllables of different languages. All have special meaning to me. It is the truest reflection of who I am.
This line of dialogue lasts 19 seconds. Mazena as a character only exists to help you with temple services and to teach you how to play a board game against a knight if you're not into killing the knight. And yet, this line of dialogue, this 19 seconds, was the thing that caused a furious backlash against Beamdog. Mazena was held up as an example of why Siege was poorly written, because those gosh darn social justice warriors couldn't help getting their cooties all over it. The inclusion of a transgendered background character was going so far in the minds of some players that it constituted a violation of Dungeons & Dragons itself. You can multi-class however you like, but do not you dare take a level in a different gender. Folks said that it was liberal tokenism, that Beamdog was, to quote one Steam review, forcing an agenda down our throats, which prompted this response from Beamdog writer Amber Scott. She said, quote, I consciously add as much diversity as I can to my writing, and I don't care if people think that's forced or fake. I find choosing to write from a straight default just as artificial. I'm happy to be an SJW, and I hope to write many social justice games in the future that reach as many different types of people as possible. Everyone should get a chance to see themselves reflected in pop culture. This is an okay, if self-congratulatory response, but it would have been a much better response if the line in question wasn't, 19 seconds long. If you blink, you might actually miss it. Now, to say that trans people have no place in D&D is impossibly ignorant of both the setting and the intentions of the game. D&D is explicitly and fundamentally about exploring parts of your personality that you're not given much opportunity to express in real life. We all have heroism and bravery within us, but how often does it come up if you work 55 hours a week as a shift supervisor at Office Max? Self-expression, especially mutually supportive expression for people typically considered outsiders, is D&D's reason for its enduring cultural relevancy, the reason it genuinely mattered to so many people as a game. The cliché image of the early D&D group with scraggly beards and a Rush poster on the wall was a form of counterculture at the time. The 80s and 90s were pretty consumerist, conformist periods in a lot of ways, and D&D helped a lot of people engage in a highly creative subculture totally outside of that. Other people didn't get it and reacted with condescending hostility. Look at the 1982 Tom Hanks movie Mazes and Monsters. It assumes that people who play D&D are broken, emotionally unhinged. They'd have to be to disengage with normal pop culture so heavily, right? Tom Hanks literally cannot tell the difference between fantasy and reality by the climax of the film. The movie, and broader pop culture during that period, made no attempt to sympathetically understand that the act of withdrawal from mainstream pop culture interests was usually deliberate, that worlds of fantasy could allow a broader range of creative storytelling possibilities than limiting yourself to what's seen as valuable by the mainstream. Role-playing is intentionally empowering. It's about improv. It's about self-identity. It's about the social connection and shared experience of adventuring. Dungeons & Dragons is still the game being played here. Baldur's Gate is just the software that automates it. To have people saying that they're defending the purity of Baldur's Gate by raging against the inclusion of a trans character is an especially frustrating bit of blind idiocy. If you won't take my word for it, you can take Ed Greenwood's. He is, after all, the man who invented Forgotten Realms, and he was roused from his slumber to say, quote, "I am saddened by what I hear of the current kerfluffle raging about Siege of Dragonspear and the trans character Amber Scott designed and included in it. Folks, the Realms have always had characters, mortals and deities, who cross-dressed, changed gender, and not just to sneak past guards in adventure by way of shape-shifting magic or illusions, were actively bisexual and openly gay." He then goes on to talk about how inclusion is always at the dungeon master's discretion. And that's the thing. For all of Scott's bravado about it, it's not really a very significant act of inclusion. It's a 19-second line that's a very general summary of a potential trans experience, written by a woman who knows no more about being trans as a first-hand deal than I do. Game critic Heather Alexandra has a great piece called "Visibility is Not Enough," where she writes, quote, "Visibility is ultimately of middling worth when marginalized people are not included in the formation of their icons. It allows for the creation of inauthentic characters, the perpetuation of stereotypes, the preservation of insularities, and the continuation of professional and hobbyist cultural failings. Things are left incomplete, works are left imperfect by grand magnitudes, and the imperfection has a cost." End quote. People are saying that this kind of character is a step for progressivism in games, aren't acknowledging how minor an act of representation this is. Mizena is trivial. She's a background character, no more or less important than the guy who asks you to empty his cornfield of zombies in the first game. I think it's fair to be slightly irritated with Scott for taking credit that this is a significant act of inclusion. Alexander's article powerfully argues that inclusion is less about visibility than having an artistic voice. No matter how well-informed by anecdote people like Scott or I am, we have no idea what the human nuances of the trans experience are. Siege of Dragonspear is a pretty good example of where artistic inclusion of a trans writer might have been more powerful than basic representation of the game world. The entire Baldur's Gate series is a story about whether to accept or reject the destiny expected of you at birth. Beamdog's biggest problem with writing is that they care more about the impressions of characters than their believability. Take Glint Gardner's son, for example. He's not only derivative of the next game's Jan Jansen, he's got a voice actor who hams up the idea of the character so much that I had no desire to have him actually in my party. He had some jokes that I might have liked if they had not had voice work, but he's barely more than a shtick. The only surefire defense against accusations of tokenism in writing is artistic sincerity. Interestingly, two other areas that Beamdog discussed thinking about in a progressive context did work out quite well. Safana's character is one. They felt she was one-dimensionally flirtatious, so they gave her more of an autonomous personality. As a result, she's one of the few characters that are actually any good on account of how they began by deliberately subverting tropes, by adding dimensions to a straightforward character. The other area is Khalid and Jaheira's marriage. In the original campaign, they didn't interact too much. Here they actually talk about each other and to each other, making plans to surprise each other with anniversary gifts. It's humanizing. I don't think enough RPGs feature romances that happen independently of the player. And it makes what happens in the opening of the next game hit harder. It's in grafting this connective tissue between the first game and the second that Beamdog actually finds their voice and narrative strength. Whether or not Siege of Dragonspear is too modern a title in its sensibilities is a legitimate question, because it affects how it fits in as a middle chapter of the Baldur's Gate series. The short version is that it doesn't fit in well at all. It's very obviously a game from a different time. Why, though? It uses the Infinity Engine, it uses AD&D rules, it is structurally indistinguishable in how it plays from the original. Its very existence is a testament to how much Beamdog loved the original game. None of this, not the enhanced editions, not Siege of Dragonspear, would have happened if not for the intense passion and dedication to the original works and their legacy from Beamdog. It's fair to say that no one knows the Infinity Engine as well as they do now. The passion, ultimately, is the problem. It's too singular in its focus. Siege of Dragonspear draws from a lot of Forgotten Realms lore, but in more of a Dungeon Master's Guide kind of way, and less in a our whole target audience has read R.A. Salvatore and we have to compete with that kind of way. Siege of Dragonspear is marketed towards gamers, as game nostalgia, not as automated Dungeons & Dragons to Dungeons & Dragons fanatics. It conceives of itself as a top-down isometric RPG in a year where isometric RPGs are making a resurgence. So it structures itself like a modern computer role-playing game would, areas dense with content that you plow through a few maps at a time, in sections until you build the climax. A linear path that expects you to do everything thoroughly. Siege of Dragonspear simply does not have the sense of quiet exploration that Baldur's Gate 1 does. It's loud, it's bombastic, and damn near everything is fighting for your attention. It has neither the open world of the first game nor the open city of the second. And in keeping with modern trends, there are scavenger hunts galore. I never saw the resolution of Khalid's anniversary gift because his list of items that he needed was, even though I was looking all over the place, mostly unobtainable if you're not checking absolutely every cupboard. I'm sure I overlooked something. There's 3 or 4 other scavenger hunts for other characters that you're working towards at the same time. And most infuriatingly, the game thinks so highly of its own plot twists that it doesn't let you follow through on some of your own choices. The biggest one is when Kalar Argent, the villain, demands that you surrender so she can spare your men. You can say yes to this, but then all your advisors tell you, oh, that's ridiculous, we're not doing that, proceed with the cutscene as planned. Baldur's Gate 2 has a whole city that you can miss if you skip a boat trip, yet Siege of Dragonspear can include a minor diversionary solution. There's a sense that you're being told a story much more often than you're genuinely participating in a story, and that is the biggest missed opportunity of all the expansion. It's the most indicative of not being as familiar with tabletop gaming as Black Isle and BioWare were when they did the original. The most amateurish move a dungeon master can make is assuming that players will care about the things in the story you want them to care about. Motivating the players and keeping them within the story's orbit is a major challenge, maybe the biggest challenge. Simply providing illusion of choice doesn't cut it. For player decisions to matter, in answer of, I don't want to see this content, I want to do something different, has to be accommodated. Again, as software, not a human with an imagination, Baldur's Gate has a limited capacity to deal with players saying no, but the scripts that BioWare wrote made room for far more disagreement on the player's behalf than anything that Beamdog came up with. It's hard not to look at Siege of Dragonspear as a work of high-budget fandom. It has many of the hallmarks. The familiar but maybe too friendly companions, the sense that the writers are encyclopedically knowledgeable about Baldur's Gate but unfamiliar with common Forgotten Realms cliches and how to avoid them, as well as the general triumph of enthusiasm over editorial prudence. Siege of Dragonspear is so frustrating because, while hardly anyone is as intimately familiar with the source material as Beamdog now is, their original content doesn't reflect the lessons in storytelling that BioWare taught. Also like a work of fan art, Dragonspear is absolutely meticulous in how it connects the dots between the original works. No opportunity to fill in a significant blank is passed by. In the individual moments of the expansion, the dialogue, the encounters, there is a lot of inconsistency, but by the time I got to Throne of Bhaal and the end of the franchise entirely, I was actually pretty grateful for the time spent with Siege of Dragonspear. A middle chapter was ultimately necessary. It does 2 incredibly important things. It introduces the second game's villain and his motivations in a way that isn't absurdly abrupt, and it fleshes out the period where the player character comes to grips with their destiny after learning the truth in its totality at the first game's climax. The story that I cared about was the rise and fall of the hero of Baldur's Gate. Kalar Argent's crusade may be the motivating catalyst for the plot in Siege of Dragonspear, but her story falls flat on account of the predictability and trope-blind storytelling that I've been discussing. Every effort was made to make Kalar seem morally dynamic. You see scenes of her writing letters to the families of her fallen soldiers, you see her calling for mercy for you and your party members from her lieutenants, and you see her explaining that she isn't unreasonable, just unstoppable. But her whole crusade is a blatantly bad idea. Lead a massive army to Dragonspear Castle, pass into the 9 Hells, save the souls of loved ones who were trapped there years ago. First, it's hard to believe, even in a fantasy campaign like this, that her plan was such an easy sell to such a vast army. Much is made of her charisma, but there have been many crusades on Hell, and all of them were doomed. A crusade on Hell appropriate for a party in the level 7 to 9 range is especially doomed, and it genuinely boggles the mind why anyone is willing to get behind it. It's a cool idea for the player and for the writers to toy with, but if you lived in that world, it would be common knowledge that you should say no to this. Kalar Argent herself ought to know it, and she ought to know not to trust her obviously villainous advisor Heffernan. All the effort made to portray Kalar as a nuanced, dynamic leader attempting to balance compassion with obsession is handicapped by a feeling of absolute exasperation that she won't just chill the fuck out and think about why this never, ever works, even for beings of the higher planes. She's Azamar, so she's half-blooded from the heavens like you're half-blooded from the hells, but that will not cut it, and it unfolds so predictably. She's betrayed, the crusade falls apart, everyone dies, and it turns out there is only one soul in particular she went there for. Kalar Argent's Dragonspear Crusade is, to put it bluntly, just kind of a dick move all the way around. It's not even a plot event that's strictly necessary to bridge the two games. That narrative work takes place largely just within the frame of the expansion, a prologue and epilogue within the city of Baldur's Gate. The siege itself is an elaborate, lavishly produced side quest. It's interesting that Siege of Dragonspear borrows a plot element from Tales of the Sword Coast, since that's probably the only part of the Baldur's Gate series it genuinely surpasses in quality. At the bottom of Durlag's tower, you find the evil dagger Soul Taker, which does just about what you'd expect it to. It gets stolen at the resolution of the quest and winds up, eventually, somehow, in the hands of soulless wizard John Irenicus. Throughout the first game, you had dreams of murder, a voice insisting you will learn. It was done via scrolling text, instead of a cutscene. Siege of Dragonspear does interactive dream sequences like the second game, though, and amazingly, they're of absolutely comparable writing quality to the second game. These dreams are the most interesting thing about the expansion, the most compelling. The thing about Irenicus is that, lacking a soul, he's after yours, but he doesn't want the soul of a mewling amateur. He wants you to embrace your destiny, just so that he can rip it from you at a moment of strength. This happens about 2/3 of the way through the next game. Starting this process here, though, even farther back in the plot, makes it seem so much more grounded in a long rivalry between the two of you. Irenicus appears as a hooded figure throughout, but his voice actor, David Warner, is completely unmistakable in the role, and he's not really meant to be genuinely mysterious. It's enjoyable to see Kalar Argent and others blowing him off, not taking him seriously, not understanding the dangerous man moving amongst them. And then there's the choices you make in regards to keeping your lineage quiet or not. At the very beginning, as you leave town on your march, you can address the whispering crowd directly, shouting your heritage and a command to step aside, or else you can try to be more diplomatic. But eventually you come to Boyarsky Bridge, where Bhaal was finally and truly slain during the time of troubles when all gods walked the material plane. You have a vision of the death, and wake up with Bhaal's seals burned into the ground around you. Even if you've been trying to keep it quiet, the whole army knows that something is deeply wrong with you. That ambivalence is interesting, but underplayed. More screen time is also given to Cyric, who is trying to take Bhaal's place as Lord of Murder. In Throne of Bhaal, at the end of the series, you'll have a chat with Cyric himself, but that scene feels disconnected without what's done here to flesh out the mythological origins of how you came to be and what he's trying to do. There's even a temple of Cyric built on the ruins of a temple of Bhaal that you'll travel to. The head priestess there keeps the old priestess prisoner to torment, but she'll tell you of the time she still had eyes when she witnessed the flurry of activity trying to prepare a Bhaalspawn for their true purpose, a vessel through which the old god would be born again. All of these become major plot points in another 50 hours during the second game's expansion. For all the flaws in the plot and characters that Beamdog made, there is no denying that spending this time with extra foreshadowing makes the content that comes next in Throne of Bhaal and Baldur's Gate 2 feel more fleshed out. Siege of Dragonspear doesn't compete with the writing in Baldur's Gate 2, but it does amplify it in deeply resonant ways. The pivot toward Baldur's Gate 2 at the end is awkward, though. Irenicus, through dreams he's been sharing with you, tricks you into stabbing Ski Silvershield, a noble's daughter. There's a lot of foreshadowing at the beginning. Look after my daughter, all the regular cliches. So after the portal to hell is sealed and Dragonspear is quiet, when everyone is safe and celebrating, you're framed for murder most foul. While not framed exactly, you did do it for sure, which kind of goes against the spirit of the game. Even the scrolling text dream sequences of the first game's main campaign changed based on alignment and reputation. Here, you're not given a choice, you're just rolling with plot choices that the writers are making. So you're rightfully blamed, and then there's a long trial sequence anyway, which is based partly on good or bad deeds performed during the prologue and the Long War March. Either way, you end up being judged, you end up being disgraced, and then you're thrown in the dungeon. You begin the next game in a dungeon as well, but a different one, so you gotta break out of this one real quick before then. It wouldn't have taken much to make this feel more connected to both Siege of Dragonspear as a standalone expansion and the next game. All that would have had to be done is to tie the player's disgrace and exile to something they actually chose to do. There are many acts of war or magic committed during the siege that you could be held accountable for. They even come up during the trial. Why weren't you just flatly judged for your deeds as a child of Bhaal, now that that knowledge is public? It would have been both simpler and cleaner. They could have even turned to Neverwinter Nights 2's trial scene as a template, but nope, it's framed for murder. Hey, you did do it, though, in a frankly tangential way. When you are finally broken out of prison, some of your closest companions meet you to escort you out of the city, and there's a fun scene of reunion and adventure, and a sense that even though Baldur's Gate is behind you the way Candlekeep is behind you, your party will be together and the fun can continue. Then you're ambushed, a fade to black, with tortures and horrors to follow within minutes of beginning Baldur's Gate 2. This particular moment is done so well, and there are other individual moments that are done so well, that you see what Siege of Dragonspear could have been had it been written tighter, edited better. These are the moments that matter in the expansion. The next game is so brilliantly designed and written that many of the frustrations of Siege of Dragonspear fade away into an amorphous, lingering sense of missed opportunity. Your journey is only half done. The most remarkable thing about the second game as an RPG is how well it balances player freedom and the choice to explore meaty side content with a primary plot that feels personal and immediate the entire time. They do it by having a strong villain with a developed backstory and a voice actor who knows how to chew the scenery well. Servac was a bit of an absentee villain. His presence is felt, but you don't catch up to him until the end of the game. In the second game, Irenicus dogs you every step of the way, mostly through dreams. It's a fantastic balance. He's physically remote, and you have no idea where to find him or how. You're free to follow any lead in the meantime, but not free to ignore the dark purposes he's marked you for. Not free to ignore the cruelties he's inflicted on you and your friends. The very first thing you see in the game is Irenicus, waking you up and calmly informing you that there will be tests, that the tests will be painful, and that your cooperation is immaterial. In nearby cages are Minsk and Jahira. Dynahira, the witch Minsk was sworn to protect, is already dead by Irenicus's hand. Khalid is missing, but his defiled, tortured corpse simply lies deeper in the dungeon. Imowen is here, but she's no longer upbeat and cheerful. She's scarred for life and scared for her soul, and you both have good reason to be. Starting off this way immediately after the triumph over Sarevok at the end of Baldur's Gate 1 feels practically insane in how abruptly the tone shifts. Siege of Dragonspear makes it so much better. You already know Irenicus. This is just the moment where the pretenses are dropped. He's no longer the hooded man. You see each other honestly for the first time in this introductory moment. It doesn't work as an absolute cold introduction to one another. It does work as a climactic revelation coming on the tail end of the Dragonspear campaign. The other thing is the voice work. Growing up, I thought Irenicus had a perfect villain voice. It doesn't track quite as well a decade or two later, but it's still miles ahead of most video game antagonists because it has genuine character, consistent inflections, and personal quirks that make Irenicus feel like a serious, dangerous presence in the game world. It's not Tony Award acting, but it's got more than enough gravitas to kick off Baldur's Gate 2 with a bang, and keep the player hooked on learning more about Irenicus. And you learn quite a bit about him right off the bat. You'll find his experiments, some of which include his former lackeys, who he has literally stuffed into jars and forgotten about, leaving them in unending, excruciating torment. Not out of hate, out of apathy and disinterest. The guy has no soul, and boy howdy can you tell. He's got a room, a beautiful, elegant room where no one lives, a tribute to someone he lost, maybe. All his captive dryads are terrified of it, and of him, and of his cruelties. He's even got a portal to another plane, which you detour to briefly. Much is done to establish Irenicus's obsession and expertise, and the fact that he has tremendous amounts of both. The shock of what he does to the party he left the city of Baldur's Gate with at the end of Dragonspear dovetails perfectly with a curiosity about why, which is rewarded with just enough half-answers to hook you completely. The Shadow Thieves are attacking the dungeon you're in. Following the chaos out, you find yourself somewhere entirely new. Athkatla, the greatest city of Om, far down the coast from Baldur's Gate. The Cowled Wizards, a magic regulatory body, come in to arrest Irenicus, and he agrees, but only if they arrest Imowen too. So, to start out, it's just you, Minsk, and Jahira, wounded and bereft, all coping with loss, very far from home. A lonely, low place to begin from. You have nowhere to go but up. Shadows of Om flips the way adventuring was formatted in the last game on its head. The open world is gone, exchanged for an open city of much greater depth than the city of Baldur's Gate in the original. There's still plenty of journeying to be done outside the city, but it's more focused, no more wandering the coasts. Which is just as well, because this is not a low-level party anymore. You're in the mid-level range, where adventuring stakes are kicked up a few notches, and the party is entrusted with more interesting diversions. This is the part of D&D where you actually do run up against dragons. Even with the explosive opening, the game leaves the player free to explore at their leisure by giving them no actionable leads about Irenicus, save that the Shadow Thieves want 20,000 gold coins to share what they do know with you. So you have to adventure, if not for glory, then for the coin to find your friend. Each of the many districts of Athkatla are full to bursting with new companions, involved side quests, local color. You can solve a mystery of a serial killer in the Bridge District. You can infiltrate a rogue faction, the Shadow Thieves, in the docks. You can find out who would want to bury a man alive in the Graveyard District. Those are the short ones. Many side quests last 2 or 3 hours, sometimes more. Like the Cult of the Unseeing Eye, a beholder cult underneath the Temple District. To put a stop to them, you have to not only venture down to the cult's lair in the sewers and talk your way inside, but go even deeper. In caverns far underneath the city, you find a temple to an even older god, whose memory is almost completely extinguished. His acolytes still serve him in permanent on-death, but it's been so long they no longer remember him. They only know they're bound to be there, to wait for something. You provide the something, using the eons-old artifact being stored there to kill the beholder. All of this because you ran across a street preacher who sounded a little too predatory. Or what about the interdimensional sphere that crashed into the slums? You'll have to solve a whole other side quest to gain access, but once you do, you'll travel far outside the material plane and back again. I've lived for a long time now with RPGs that think that checklisting is questing. Baldur's Gate 2 stands in defiance of the idea with some of the most compact and enjoyable questing of any RPG. Nothing is too spread out or impenetrably obscure. The open wilderness of the last game was extremely charming, but meaningful side content was sparse. The quests that were out in the wild were mostly pretty simple. In Baldur's Gate 2, there isn't a single task that doesn't have some kind of narrative context. Keeping the game's questing focus mostly urban also helps create a more believable pacing. You're not wasting weeks wandering around in the wilderness. Imawin is still out there and still needs your help, no matter what side content you decide to do. Of course, there's that ridiculous sum of 20,000 gold standing in your way, and that serves as explicit permission to spend at least 1 or 2 weeks wandering around in the woods. The rural quests are great, denser, weightier than the rural quests of the original. By reducing the scope, they've upped the impact and the intensity. You can protect a remote town from shadows in the woods, stemming from a long-forgotten temple deep in the trees. You can restore balance to a druid circle, while at the same time freelancing for genies camped outside the nearest town. In the first game, a lot of side content was somewhat straightforward fantasy. Low-level stuff. Baldur's Gate 2 hands out experience points considerably quicker, leveling you slightly more often and to much greater heights. It'll be over level 20 by the end of the game. Above 20 is a whole different category of the Dungeons & Dragons experience, but the 9 to 20 range is the largest and most engaging level range out of the whole experience. You'll fight everything. Beholders, spirit trolls, Githyanki, mind flayers, umber hulks, dragons, adamantine golems. The whole goddamn monster manual comes out to play, and it's fantastic. A lot of the nuance of these inclusions is lost if you're playing on story mode, though. The thing that's especially exciting for someone who was already deeply familiar with the AD&D rule set is already knowing the strengths, weaknesses, and special characteristics of all of these monsters. Their importance and their danger, along with the tactics used to defeat them, are expected to be familiar to the player as the mythology of the Forgotten Realms. That's an assumption that can't remotely be made about contemporary players. These more difficult monsters are much more likely to use lethal moves like disintegration, level drain, and mind domination, the latter of which forces you to kill one of your own companions. The basic level of combat difficulty is notably increased over the previous game, not because of player fragility, but because of this huge constellation of deadly and infuriating spell effects, and how quickly they can cause a party to fall apart and die. Turning to low difficulties can alleviate a lot of this. Story mode seems to have cut the time spent stuck in entanglement confusion spells by at least half what it used to be, but it also makes the combat homogeneous and boring. Higher level adventuring within the AD&D does genuinely present amazing tactical situations, but these monsters are meant to use these weird abilities in a setting where players can respond more imaginatively. You can use cover, run and hide, use subterfuge, cause architectural damage, and knock pillars down, the whole gamut, but that's only tabletop D&D. Baldur's Gate just has attacks, abilities, spells, and your tactical placement within the room. It's totally possible to be successful within the confines of those actions, but for people who enjoy D&D more for the storytelling experience than for the charts and the tables, it's a struggle. For players who have heard that Baldur's Gate is a good PC RPG and don't even know what Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is, it's more than a struggle. It's a language of combat interaction that's impenetrably dated, gaming's own Sanskrit. Yet Baldur's Gate 2 feels a lot more modern than the first does, and a lot of that is in how much more interactive with the player and with each other the companions are. Most things in Baldur's Gate 2 have a very personal feel to them. Friendship, family play a more prominent role in the themes. This is the game, where that very particular BioWare feeling, where the ensemble comes together as friends, where the player has an opportunity for goofy romance, where there's a moment right before the climax in which everyone talks about their feelings. All of that came from this game. This was the game that set that BioWare mold, that, despite having moved away from the mechanical structures of long ago, still gets reused over and over again in the emotional structure of BioWare titles. It works so well here, it feels so natural. Baldur's Gate 2 thinks harder about Dungeons & Dragons in terms of what a PC game can do differently than a tabletop campaign, as opposed to fidelity in translating the experience from one medium to another. Part of that is in connecting your companions to the background world in a more concrete way. Instead of companions joining your party pretty much at the drop of a hat, standing around and waiting for something to do, you need to do quests and resolve something the character is already trying to do. Jaheira even has her own quest involving her membership in the Harpers and her friendship with the Ballspawn that causes her to leave the party for a time. What you do in the game, how you act, causes ripples in time. You might not see a consequence for a companion occur right away, but no one escapes their actions in this game. The companions all advocate for their values and beliefs and react to yours. If you're too bad or too good, or in Ares' case, too promiscuous, they won't be shy about voicing their disapproval. If you have a mixed alignment party, it's even better, as the choices you make will spark all sorts of passionate arguments between companions, who will belittle, insult, and occasionally flirt with each other as you adventure. It's hard to know what will trigger a conversation, though. In Dragon Age, it's obviously environmental. Certain patches of map prompt to inter-party dialogue. In Baldur's Gate, it seems random. I've had Minsk start talking to me about the finer points of caring for giant space hamsters while in the middle of being captured by mind flayers. I've had characters ask me if I've ever thought of them as more than friends, moments after solving a millennia-old riddle. The conversations are fine, but the timing is nearly always janky as hell. There's a strong sense that you won't get to see many of the conversations, that they don't trigger often enough to see half of what's possible between the characters. Not all the characters survive the transition from the quick sketch they were in the first game to the fuller, deeper characters they aim for in the second, either. Minsk is one. He's very beloved for the warmth of his character and his jokes about Boo, the aforementioned giant space hamster, but the fact of the matter is, if you're playing in a tabletop setting, the bottomless pool of butt-kicking and hamsters jokes would get so old. It gets so old here, too. Minsk in the first game was defined by his quest to save Dynahir, and then his jokes after she gets rescued from the gnolls. Here in the second, even he's grasping for purpose. If you have Aerie in your party, he may eventually pledge to protect her as he protected Dynahir, but the direct replacement feels awkward. Similarly, there's a romance possible with Jaheira. I like the way it's written, but what happened to Khalid, it feels a little too simple. Jaheira's got one over on Minsk as a complex character, though, on account of her alignment. Commitment to balance and neutrality is difficult, and she explains how she approaches her alignment really well. On the other hand, Aerie, the wingless of Ariel, has an arc for her character that's interesting, but an execution of that arc that's infuriating. She's a wide-eyed innocent at first, stuttering and meek, and then she gets angry and depressed over having had her wings taken from her during captivity, which is fair. And then finally she starts to get comfortable. The end result, confident and grounded Aerie, is actually a very enjoyable character. All her transitional states to get there are bordering on completely intolerable. She's got a male counterpart in Animan, who seems to have wandered directly out of a Danielle Steele paperback. They do try to make him a real character, give him real conflict, but he is trapped within his smug do-goodery. Animan, I also want to point out, is intended to be the only romance option for female characters. Romantic subplots have become such a staple in BioWare titles that they're taken completely for granted. They're always clunky, and they're always awkward. Baldur's Gate 2 really takes the cake, though. The love theme from Shadows of Om soundtrack piece that plays is saccharine beyond all saving, but whether you've got a male or female protagonist, none of your options are really very good. Aerie's a doe-eyed, gosh, I'm so clumsy and innocent type, which is probably the dumbest of all fantasy romance tropes. They do switch it up a bit. If you say yes the first time she tries to get cozy, she'll later break it off on account of things moving too fast. Aerie does have agency, but it's smack-yourself-in-the-face terrible dialogue. Jaheira is better for dialogue, but the fact that she's so quick to preference the Ballspawn over poor stuttering Khalid feels cold. The most interesting by far is Bavconia. She's been in the game series since the first, a cold and condescending drow elf living a life of exile on the surface. She's mean, she's arrogant, she's sexually aggressive, and she requires actual role-playing to make the romance work. The typical BioWare romance is like the others in this game, like Ares or Animan's, where you're nice, and then you live happily ever after. Viconia is an example of the kind of tempestuous, fiery romances that games would be so much more interesting if they included more of. Like Aerie, she doesn't have a lot of respect for the player if you sleep together right off the bat, but in her case, because she comes from a militantly matriarchal society and you were too easy a conquest, therefore unworthy of further interest. She doesn't want a yes man, she wants someone to fight with. You actually have to fight well together to make it work. Can't be too nice, can't be too distant, you actually have to think about her character is actually complex enough to require thinking about. It's also the easiest to break this subplot, and I think that's why you don't see this sort of thing too often in games. It's easy to wind up with a resolution where the romance really just doesn't work out. You have to use literal magic and a persuasion check if you want the relationship to continue in the Throne of Bhaal expansion. The way most BioWare romances are done is simply playing the ego. Choose to be nice to someone, and then they like you, will give you extra compliments during your adventure. Again, that's most of them in this game, too. But Viconia is different. She's an illustration of what a romantic subplot looks like, divorced from expectations of success. I chose to go through with the Aerie plotline on this playthrough instead because there's a child involved, and I wanted to see how the familial themes would extend into it, but that was a real bad call. But at least I had a call. If you're a female player character, it's assumed that Animan's hunky-hunkiness is universally appealing. A handful of vocal players think that BioWare is too progressive these days for providing LGBT romances and a wider range of romances for female PCs, but this is the alternative. 3 varied options for a straight male, and 1 shitty one for everybody else. Moral alignment has always been critical to Dungeons & Dragons. It's not very surprising that subplots exploring sexual alignment have become more and more popular as time's gone on. Beamdog makes no major improvements to the game, besides making the interface easier to use in a couple of spots, allowing map zooming, and making the game compatible with modern operating systems. They add content and characters, both their regulars from the first Enhanced Edition and a new one, but they still stick out. Notably, there's a quest with a character named Hexat, who turns out to be, dun-dun-dun, a vampire. Now, there are options to work with vampires in the main story, and her presence as an evil thief really rounds out the variety of alignments and classes available for your party. But when you find out that she's an ancient and powerful vampire, you're still expected to free her and complete the quest even if you're not following the vampire plots. I chose to kill her instead because I was taking a hard stance against the undead in my playthrough, but it broke the quest. It reset Hexat's emissary to the Copper Coronet, but none of the rest of the quest. It's like they didn't even playtest what happens if you don't want to complete the quest and don't want her in your party. Out of any single thing Beamdog does poorly with Baldur's Gate, it's this failure to take no for an answer from the player that's the most glaring, and it's that tendency that gets shown up the most by the gameplay design of Shadows of Amn. For example, ignoring the Shadow Thieves for too long and side-questing past when you hit the 20,000 gold mark allows you to renegotiate your deal. You can go down in price twice just for holding out. There aren't very many non-violent options, but choosing to do the most good can get quite complicated. For example, late in the game, your romantic interest is kidnapped by Bodhi, a vampire. She turns your romance companion into a vampire, and you're forced to slay them. This is an abrupt and final end of that companion and the romance subplot, unless you go on this whole big quest to find some books, who bought the books from who, what the books say, where the temple in the books is located, what ritual you need to perform at the altar listed in the books, to purify your soul, and to bring them back to you. Alternately, you can move right along to the climax in a more straightforward vengeance. The motivation works either way. But doing good requires some kind of sacrifice, and the most reasonable sacrifice a game designer can ask of their players is one of convenience. It's not the only soul you can redeem in the game either. Yoshimo's betrayal is a pretty good example of a cliché done right. It's obvious that Yoshimo is a plant by Irenicus, and you can see his betrayal coming. He can too, though. He can actually come to genuinely value your friendship. There's a magical bond in place preventing him from backing out of the betrayal, so it happens, but it's got this heartbreaking inevitability to it that's so much more interesting than, say, Heffernan from Siege of Dragonspear. If you take Yoshimo's heart and keep it with you for several weeks, you can take it to a priest who will release Yoshimo's spirit from torment. Having a betrayal is standard fantasy storytelling. Having a forgiveness come afterwards is quality fantasy storytelling. And then there's game design that goes above and beyond, like the Sahagwin City. After getting enough money to find out where Imoen went, you sail out to the wizard's prison of Spellhold. When you have to leave, you can take a portal to the Underdark or sail home. But you're given a silver sword of the Githyanki by the boat captain if you choose to sail, and the Githyanki always come back for their swords. They sink the ship, and you wind up prisoners at the bottom of the ocean. You must escape, into the Underdark. So the choice was illusory after all, but the journey was still affected by your decision in a profound way. You either see an entire city or you don't. Beamdog does not do quest design like this, and I don't know how they could miss one of the biggest lessons that this game has to teach. The section of the game with Spellhold in the Underdark is the part where the pacing dramatically changes as well. As soon as you pay the fee and go after Imoen and Irenicus, you're stuck on a very linear journey for the next dozen hours or so. Which is a good change, actually. The free-form adventuring you're doing to pull the money together is fun, but the drive to continue on after your nemesis and missing friend is equally strong. So when you continue, you just keep barreling forward into twists and revelations that set up the climax one after another after another. Then you get a little more freeform time to tie up anything you might have forgotten to do during the earlier freeform part, but that's it. The first act of Baldur's Gate 2 is classic adventuring, pulling the money together. The second is a high-level adventure into some of the most dangerous places in Faerun. And then the third is the climactic confrontations, in order of importance, concluded with a final battle for control of your divine soul. But back to Spellhold. It's a trap. Irenicus knew that he was a better wizard than his wardens would be, so he simply took over the asylum prison when he got there. His research on Imoen continued. Your predictable arrival was foreseen and desired. He needs your soul, and so he rips it right out. Imoen's, too. He gives Imoen's soul to his sister Bodhi. Yours he keeps for himself. Bodhi is supposed to kill you, but she's a wild-tempered vampire and sets you loose in a deadly labyrinth in which to hunt you down personally for sport. You triumph, of course, but this mid-game villainy is fantastic in the overall arc of the player character. The previous games were a fight over whether you were worthy of being a child of murder, whether you wished it to be known. This is about how, regardless of your willingness to accept it, you and your heritage are bound together, inseparable. It doesn't matter if you want to embrace what you are. Without it, you'll die. Your survival requires you to accept that murder is part of your nature. The Slayer form gives these themes a presence in the gameplay. In the absence of your soul, you gain a powerful ability. You can shapeshift into an unpredictable monster, one of the avatars of your dead father. It can do things like tear down doors, take tremendous damage, and murder with great efficiency, but you can barely control it. You'll attack your party constantly, and using it lowers the party's moral reputation overall. It's a great and valuable tool. If you follow the good path, though, the option will always be available to you, but the noble thing is to never use it, even when the need is great. So they've set you up with a genuine hero's dilemma using plot-driven mechanical abilities. Immediately afterwards, you're given the opportunity to really explore your evil side in depth inside the drow city of Ustnatha. It makes for a powerfully memorable and dramatic transition from the first half of the game to the back half. Ustnatha is a fantastic piece of mid-game design, and it has some elements that I wish modern BioWare would return to. In a newer BioWare RPG, there's usually a high-tension, high-stakes mission of some sort that has everyone talking and pivots things in a new direction right in the middle, but it's a one-time deal, like the Winter Palace quest in Inquisition. Ustnatha is a whole new city hub with a large outdoor Underdark map that has dungeons radiating off of that as well. It's a whole new world in the caverns underneath the one you've spent most of the game exploring. Everything's pretty flipped on its head culturally, too. A majestic silver dragon has had her eggs taken by the drow in the city and wants them back, so she entranced your party to look like the drow so you can take the place of a group of travelers she recently slaughtered. Where once you had freedom, now you have to complete tasks for superiors within strict time limits. Where you would have chosen dialogue to express yourself, now you're trying to choose the options that won't blow your cover. There's even a scene, if you've got a male character, where you're demanded to perform sexually for your boss. You can talk your way out of it, or let it happen, or blow your cover entirely by refusing. However, there's a good chance it'll ruin your romantic subplot if you can't or don't avoid the encounter. The drow are an incredibly sexist society and do sexist things constantly. It's just gender-flipped. That's kind of their point, that being evil, cruel, and selfish looks pretty much the same on anyone, regardless of the gender. They've always filled that thematic position, for long before the game. This is part of why the backlash against Beamdog for including progressive content is so moronic. Being explorative with social roles and gender roles is explicitly written into the fabric of the setting, in the original games even. The sharp contrasts make for a great change of pace and narrative opportunity as well. Since nearly everyone in town is absolutely terrible, there are numerous opportunities for betrayal, and betrayal that even good characters can feel okay about participating in. This section of the game shakes up pretty much every last convention in how the player interacts with the world and the questing, but just for a little while until you can escape the city's cruelties. It also shows off the depth of effort put into accommodating different playstyles. If you don't want to pretend to be part of the drow, you can just attempt to kill them all and find your own way out. You can kill the Silver Dragon and take her hoard. You can play the games of drow manipulation and take them seriously, indulge in all kinds of social evils that Ustnatha has to offer. Or you can arrange a triple cross, gaining everyone's trust to the point where they all die and leave you holding the spoils. For a couple minutes anyway, until the alarm is sounded. Difficult tasks are given multiple solutions. Like the matriarch needs a powerful smell ingredient, either a beholder eye stalk or an illithid elder brain. You get the eye stalk in the first room of the Baldur dungeon. If it's too hard after that, you're already set, you can back out any time. Or you could be trapped in a psionic nightmare by venturing into the Mind Flayer Den, where you'll be taken prisoner and made to fight for the illithid's amusement before organizing a difficult, puzzle-heavy escape. The choice is yours. As far as the narrative is concerned, how you get to the next step of the plot can shift in any of these directions. Irenicus is already several steps ahead of you, and reacting to his unfolding machinations is all you can do. You'll eventually be spat back out onto the surface just as Irenicus reaches his goal, seizing control of the tree from which elves draw their ageless strength. Yep, that old trope. What's interesting, though, is how personal all of it is to Irenicus. That bedroom back in the introductory dungeon is a replica of the bedroom that he and the Queen of Elves once shared when he was her court wizard, but nothing was ever enough for the guy. He tried to feed on the tree, take power from his entire people and make it his own. For this, he and his sister had their souls taken. They would grow old, die, fade to nothing. For the most powerful wizard of his age, it was maybe the most tremendous insult he could have been given. The trick of Irenicus as a villain is that revealing his backstory does not make him seem larger and more villainous. It makes him seem smaller, petty, mortal. He had it all once, and he tossed it aside because he just can't help but be a magical jackass to people. He's come full circle in his own journey. He's experiencing his own climax, and meanwhile, your character has finally the opportunity to take revenge for the indignities committed when the game opened. He's a horrible person, John Irenicus, but he's even less now than he was before, even with your soul. He's beatable. The only other BioWare villain with a similar feel to Irenicus is Saren from Mass Effect, but Saren's not himself all the way. Conflict with Saren is inevitable because Sovereign is pushing it that way from behind the scenes. Irenicus, though, is narcissistic beyond any redemption, which makes him a great villain for either a good or evil character to face. Stopping him is the obvious good, but for evil, there is a strong narrative satisfaction in smashing this pretender who thinks they can steal your murderous power and get away with it. Both ways, Irenicus's arrogance makes him a tremendously satisfying antagonist. Baldur's Gate is about the soul of the Ballspawn, so the climax is only partially about Irenicus. It's primarily what you'll do with your tainted soul if you do manage to somehow earn it back. Before the final confrontation, you have the by now BioWare standard, "It's been good to be at your side," half-goodbyes that preface the dire stakes of the climax. The difference between this and some later titles, though, is that the goodbye is well-deserved. When you kill Irenicus, it kills you too, and the vortex of your missing soul drags you and all your companions down to hell right at the minute that should be your victory. It's a genius writing decision since it touches on and one-ups the revelations of the first game. There, Sarevok confirmed the half-truths that you may not have wished to know. Now, those truths are made manifest, a maze of stone and flesh meant to challenge the Ballspawn and determine if they are truly, truly worthy of getting their soul back. Each of the 5 puzzle challenges has a good and an evil solution. The evil one has no consequence for the player, and gives them great wealth and power. Demons will injure and kill your companions in your place. You will inherit the symbols and protections of your dead father's realm. The good path, however, involves sacrifice, refusing these objects, taking the pain in place of your companions. In fact, the selfishness test will not only damage your character if you aim for the good resolution, it will permanently drain a few of your statistics for the rest of the next expansion. The scars are permanent and meaningful. If they were not, what would the sacrifice actually mean? The evil route is gluttonous, you and Irenicus in a demonic arms race for who can acquire the most trinkets and gifts before you clash one final time in your father's kingdom. The good route isn't one that denies power, it's one that says that the player has enough strength already, enough so that they need no further help from tricksy demons. The demons respect this. You're not evil, true, but your will has power, and it shapes the outcome all the same, maybe more impressively because your decisions stand in defiance of the logic of your father's hellscape. Each path has a thematically resonant experience, coming from opposite approaches to player motivation and player ideology. Both are accommodated. The plot of Baldur's Gate 2 is resolved when you wrest control of your soul from Irenicus. Irenicus is trapped in hell with no power and no escape, while you and your companions return to the material plane, ready to adventure once more. You've confronted your heritage, and either embraced it or asserted your moral dominance over it. Supposing you wrapped up all of your side quests after emerging from the Underdark, the end of Baldur's Gate 2 feels very complete. From start to finish, it is focused on Irenicus and the contest of wills between the two of you. Things done in the game are done within that frame. There's really only one lingering question, and it's one that's been quietly waiting in the wings since your first fragile steps in the journey from Candlekeep. What will ultimately become of the Lord of Murder's empty throne? Saravac was not its inheritor, nor was Irenicus. Are you? What would you do with the power of a god? The single-mindedness by which Throne of Bhaal goes about concluding the trilogy is an incredible strength. There's enough going on in the expansion to have been spread out into a full sequel, but instead it's condensed into a relatively short expansion experience. What happened is that they cut out nearly all of the side content. They chuck the open world and they chuck the open city and leave the design unencumbered by scavenger hunts like Siege of Dragonspear. It does feel sudden. All at once, it's the time of the prophecy at last. All of the surviving Bhaalspawn are warring openly with one another all of a sudden, and the 5 most powerful of them are standing like dominoes in between you and your father's vacant throne. I do wish there had been more of a soft transition, some extra scenes and adventures between Irenicus' fall and the long-awaited time of prophecy, but that just wasn't how Baldur's Gate 2 started, and the hard shift in tone and focus is just how they chose to do openers at the time, I guess. Plus, it is awfully exciting for a 100-hour-plus series to roll up its sleeves for the last chapter and declare, immediately and truthfully, that it's time to give all of this a wrap. The pacing works like a countdown as each one of the 5 fall by your hand. The throne lies at the end. Meanwhile, everything has much more of a mechanically relaxed pace as well. Leveling couldn't be more opposite from the first Baldur's Gate. Now that you're epic level in the 20 to 30 range, you'll be cruising through those levels at the rate of maybe 1 an hour or so. You're fighting the most powerful monsters in the Monster Manual, gaining special epic-level abilities that channel incredible power, cutting down men, women, monsters, gods, anything that gets in your way. That's typical for video game progression. The late-game player is often hugely overpowered. What's atypical is showing how terrifying that would be for regular folks to have to be around. Throne of Bhaal has a couple small cities, and both of them suffer tremendously because of your passing. Even if you're a good character, trying to do right and save who you can, there's no denying that everyone around you is suffering because of what you are. You might be a paladin, but you're still a child of murder. You can triumph over your 5 siblings because it's the right thing to do, to spare others the chaos, but you're still carving a ragged and bloody path straight to your father's throne. If you're evil, this is your heyday. The whole world now trembles before you. They tremble even if you're good, though, which is a wonderfully uncomfortable position to put the do-gooder in. How can you defeat the great evil when the evil is partially from within you? When the surest way to keep people safe is to see that they never cross paths with you in the first place? It would be easy to miss the more free-form, open-world areas of the first game and the dozens of tightly plotted, well-considered side quests of the second game if it wasn't for how quickly and thoroughly the expansion goes about tying off all of its loose ends. Baldur's Gate 2 had so many lengthy, impressive side quests that those ended up making up the significant bulk of the content. Same thing with Baldur's Gate 1, though it had more of a quantity over quality approach. Throne of Bhaal is the end, a long, long goodbye to the whole Baldur's Gate experience. There's no more need for freeform adventure when your own power has grown so great that you couldn't fly under the radar that way anymore even if you wanted to. You're being pulled along to godhood, and cannot slow it down. The lack of side questing actually kind of underlines what's going on in the plot. What side quests there are don't always have resolutions that are positive, and a lot of people are dying all around you. The whole feeling is, generally speaking, really dire. What makes it hit so hard and work so well is how this really is the other end of the character arc that began hundreds of hours ago in Candlekeep. You hear it in the dialogue of your companions, who question their place beside you. Minsc even explicitly asks, where is there a place for hamsters and ass-kicking when you're up against prophecy and the concerns of gods? Eri wonders, how is it that she's become one of the most powerful mages in Faerun without really even trying or expecting to? What Jaheira agreed to do in the first place was look after Gorian's ward when they showed up at the Friendly Arms Inn. It cost her almost everything, her husband, her membership in the Harpers, her sense of balance. The long-term emotional costs of the journey start piling up on your companions, and on the player character too, and rather than shying away and keeping the tone light like previous adventures, the script embraces the ambivalence and fear that goes alongside being caught in the Bhaalspawn's slipstream. This is why a special Destiny plotline cannot be done in an in-person tabletop group. Only one of you is going to make a difference, and the others must find ways to make peace with that. Who are these people apart from you? As your star ascends, it burns those close to you, and you must deal with the fallout from that. They'll stay with you, but with misgivings. Even Aerie's stupid romance has a moment of clarity when Aerie talks candidly about the fact that should you become a god, it leaves her pregnant and alone, which kind of sucks for her. But being a powerful archmage, she feels like she'll be alright in the end. Aerie has actually become a strong character by the end of this series. All the companions have. The length of time a player invests in the Baldur's Gate series is uncommon even by today's standards. It took me around 120 hours, close to what Mass Effect took me, but Mass Effect's the only other BioWare franchise that's tried to preserve the same player character between games in a direct line of plot and causality like Baldur's Gate. Mass Effect, though, is much more about action and spectacle. With story mode on, Baldur's Gate is pretty much 120 hours of pure dialogue with a side of inventory management. The emotional investment in a cumulative journey of that extreme length is huge. Even if you played on just normal difficulty, you'd double the 120 hours I put into it easily. Playing through all the multiple ways the series can be played could take thousands of hours. That feeling of stress and melancholy, of nervousness, and approaching the end of a journey that would define these characters' lives and deaths in ways they never quite agreed to, is something that the player can really relate to as well. The end approaches for everyone in Throne of Bhaal. The amount of exposition and lore you end up with sometimes feels a little too straightforward, actually. A Solar, a representative from the heavens, has come to guide you to the final parts of your destiny. She slowly unlocks 5 challenges, like hell at the climax of Baldur's Gate 2, one after each of the 5 of your siblings is killed. Each time a challenge unlocks, she summons important characters, both living and dead, to literally explain what's going on in detail. If there had been more time and money, these revelations might have taken the form of side quests and adventures, but they're instead condensed down to these brief but detailed information dumps. Maybe it's a little too easy this way, but it's still much better than leaving all the background out. With no significant side questing or optional areas, you'll jump from dungeon to massive plot revelation to small town to dungeon, back to massive plot revelation in a matter of a couple of hours. The design of the combat encounters is way different to accommodate the epic level experience as well, pitting you against waves of enemies, entire armies at once. Do you remember how a wolf could kill you in a single hit for the first few hours of play back in the first game? Look at you now, a murdering fool. Your unstoppability is almost a joke, and the balance is pretty messed up in the player's favor, even on higher difficulties once everybody in your party scrapes the level 30 limit, acquiring 10 or more godlike abilities. In fact, there's a whole joke sequence that unusually breaks the fourth wall to deliver some great punchlines. A wizard tasks you with getting a beholder eye stalk, and everyone in your party groans about how beneath you all that is now. So you find a nearby party of low-level adventurers who had been turned to stone, and you put them on the case. Several days later, they return. They decide they can take you on, and then they die immediately, so the low-level fellow reloads his save game and gives you the eye stalk without complaint. That was all of you, your PC, your companions, back in the first game. Now, you're a couple short hours away from becoming a permanent part of Forgotten Realms mythology. It's a totally different game experience from Baldur's Gate 1, both tonally and mechanically, but neither is as resonant without the other. You are given one last big hurrah for side content, Watcher's Keep. It's like Durlag's Tower, an incredibly dense puzzle box dungeon experience with the toughest enemies and puzzles in the series. Everything about it is huge. The maps, the loot, the challenge, and finally the boss. The setup is, again, classic and simple. There is a great evil and many treasures sealed within the keep. The wards are weakening after millennia of imprisonment, and you must go strengthen them. The execution of this is wildly complex, though. There is one level of portal mazes where 2 groups of fiends, the demons of the chaotic evil plane and the devils of the lawful evil, fight their unending blood war within the confines of the keep, like a war in a bottle. There's a machine, an impossible machine, that can unlock the hidden secrets of the planes and permanently boost your stats, or else kill you in cosmically painful ways. Durlag's Tower was the pinnacle of difficulty for the first game and its expansions, and Watcher's Keep is its absolute peer and challenge. Again, it's a part of the game where playing on story mode will rob you of the real impact of the experience, although for many players, story mode may be the only thing that lets them complete it. In the recent Netflix hit Stranger Things, it opens with a bunch of kids playing D&D in the mid-80s. They're guessing at the worst creature that the Dungeon Master would be willing to throw at them, and they all agree that they would be the most screwed if it was Demogorgon, the Prince of Demons. He's the ultimate oh-shit monster of the original rule set, and he is just beneath your feet. When you reach the lowest level, unsealing the prison and sticking your nose in, a voice is all you hear. You have the option of solving the quest without confronting the voice. 2 options for that, actually. If you reseal the prison now, you'll be trapped within and die. The Watchers betrayed you. So the voice suggests that you seek revenge. The Watchers counteroffer with a spell that won't kill you. Or you could stand, shout, and challenge the voice, whereupon Demogorgon will appear and fuck you up royally. Killing him isn't even the optimal quest resolution. Slaying him on the material plane just allows him to go back home to hell. You've freed him just the same as if you had released him deliberately. Only the path of continuing to trust the Watchers after their betrayal would have kept the Prince of Demons trapped. But you know what? At least it explains the blood war raging on the upper floors. This is what high-level Dungeons & Dragons modules are all about in the tabletop setting. Difficult, excessively lethal dungeons where the worst comes true and you just hope that you and your friends can come out the other side. Glittering riches that mortals were not meant to hold await, if you can live to carry them out. Outcomes within the modules attract the notice of the divines. But again, the reward is in the long process to get there. Watcher's Keep is a parting gift to the hardcore, years-long Dungeons & Dragons enthusiasts for whom this game was really made. It's even more of a time capsule than the game around it. While much of Baldur's Gate 2 has survived into the modern BioWare toolkit, they have never made anything quite as defiantly niche as Watcher's Keep again. In the challenges given to you by the Solar, there's a couple of them that are real marvels. The first is where you actually confront yourself pretty much at level 1. Your innocence, before you left Candlekeep, before you knew. Would you go back? The answer seems obvious. No, of course not. To go back is to erase all the moments of wonder and danger you've had. Whether you asked for it or not, your destiny has made you. You must kill your own innocence to continue, but really, it was dead long ago. Maybe it's goofy to put it in the game literally like this, but that's part of what's special about Baldur's Gate. The series pays close, serious attention to the long arc of the plot, the one conveyed in dreams for every title until now, when the time for dreams is over and the time to choose has come. The other great moment is where Cyric, one of the most powerful voices of the many hells, comes to have a chat with you. He was intending to become the new Lord of Murder himself. You weren't thinking of competing with him for that, were you? It's quite a thing, from rats in the basement to trolls in the castle to having power lunch with an immortal evil. The interesting thing is, at the time, I didn't actually think I was competing with Cyric. I thought to myself, I'm trying to be good. I can't be the Lord of Murder. I'll turn it down. This, of course, pleases Cyric immensely, which means that it can't have actually been the right thing to do at all. Doing nothing with the power you've been given is rarely actually the greatest good, even if being humble is generally seen as virtuous. It's an interesting way to play it. You could absolutely decline to take the throne, to go back to being immortal, to go back to being an adventurer, but then you're giving all that power to Cyric, who will gladly take what you won't touch. There often is no single binary way to do good or do evil. We do what we can with the pieces we're given, and we hope that we have not fucked up too badly. Godhood is a complicated business, but this whole time the games have been telling you that you cannot simply wash your hands of what you've been given without genuine consequence. This all spirals down toward the inevitable confrontation where only a woman named Melisande is standing in your way. She was Bhaal's head priestess, and when the time came to sacrifice the Bhaalspawn and restore him, she left him hanging. She would wait, plot, gather the others, use you to kill the others, and then she'd kill you, taking all your essence for herself. She would be Lord of Murder. Blood be damned. She's an okay villain, no Irenicus. In the scheme of things, she's just an obstacle. When you kill her, you've killed the last thing in the game. Will you walk away or embrace what you've spent hundreds of hours becoming? The Solar explains that if you choose to accept godhood, you won't lose yourself. Murdering's almost all you've done in these games, but you've still done good, haven't you? Haven't you used murder to help? Would it be so bad for the heavens and hells to have a Lord of Murder who cared about motive? The choice is left to the player. It's been a long road to get here. The whole story kicks off in Baldur's Gate 1 with a quote from Melando's prophecy, the one playing out its final moments right now. The prophecy only ever said that this moment of choice would come. It didn't say how it would actually turn out. Throne of Bhaal does not open any last-minute mysteries. It does not leave any cliffhangers. Throughout its length, it methodically ties up every loose end that relates to the central plot. When it's over, it's over. Beamdog said they want to do an Infinity Engine-powered Baldur's Gate 3, but I sincerely hope that they don't. What they've done with Siege of Dragonspear, for all its flaws, does contribute positively to the pacing and overall impact of the franchise, but the series packs such a huge nostalgic punch because Throne of Bhaal ends it all so completely and conclusively. It is the absolute and final stage of the journey. I decided to ascend to godhood and got a cutscene telling me how my character would act in divinity as they had under my direction, with compassion when possible, with decisive action when not. My actions mattered, the cutscene said, not just now, but almost infinitely afterwards, because my will was now part of the divine pantheon. Of course, as Bhaal himself would tell you, that divine order gets shaken up from time to time, but when people talk about how much they love Baldur's Gate, how important the memory of the franchise is, I think this ending is a huge, huge part of it. It's different from a book or a tabletop experience. It's not just the story you're being told, and it's not just the story from a friend. It has the pop culture legitimacy of a franchise novel, fused with the creative agency of a tabletop campaign, but in a way that's laser-focused on a single solitary player in a way that the tabletop campaign couldn't do. This kind of ego-stroking wouldn't work in a different medium, but the act of beating a game like this, especially in the days before story mode, was a huge time sink, a huge emotional investment on the player's part. So the ending says, this time you've spent, these things you've done, they matter, they will be remembered. That's your reward. You didn't play for the high score, but you're assured by the game that there will be a high honor given anyway. It's like the statue commemorating your party in Tradesmeet. When the game is uninstalled, when a new game is started, that accomplishment is wiped away. It's completely illusory. But at the moment, it feels like a real reward, like what you've done has been acknowledged by the game world and some sort of impact has been made. The end of Throne of Bhaal, the end of Baldur's Gate as a whole, pulls off this trick with true expertise. The game is over in a way that's natural and total, and the ending gives you permission to feel proud or sad or relieved or whatever kind of large feelings the final payoff of your long investment provokes. Folks were so let down by the original ending of the Mass Effect trilogy because it asked so many more questions than it was really willing to answer, because it does not have the focused countdown to a decisive ending that Baldur's Gate had. It didn't provide release. It didn't provide validation for what the player had been pouring into the series and the character on their end. Not on release, anyway. Throne of Bhaal does that. It's even bittersweet in the epilogues. While some companions have happy endings, none ever truly recover from being in the Bhaalspawn's company. Some end up dead. Many end up unfulfilled and miserable. It's something that new BioWare wouldn't really dare do, I feel. The melancholy of the epilogue also lends to the feeling of finality and completeness. The story ended well for you, sure, but you ascended beyond mortal concerns. Everyone else still has to deal with them. The full experience of Baldur's Gate has many frustrations, and if Steam statistics are anything to go by, very few are willing to weather them to see the journey through from first step to last. There's nothing you could change about these games to make that any different. They're a product of their time, and the product of our time, Siege of Dragonspear, just doesn't live up to the quality of the originals. The cultural moment when fantasy fandom was based in novels and tabletop modules is long past. To recreate Baldur's Gate, that's the page you'd have to get everybody back on, and that will never happen again. But here these games are, and the adventure unfolds all over again every time someone hits the new game button. To those with the patience to put up with the archaic rules of the Baldur's Gate setting, these games are undoubtedly some of the best computer role-playing games ever released. They're important. But their importance can be hard to see if you just can't get past, hey, what's Thaco? Thanks for watching.
I want to particularly thank all my patrons for their patience with this video. It's taken a longer time than usual. It always does when I try to tackle a BioWare franchise. But it's taken literally a couple months longer than I said this video was going to take, and a number of things that I said was probably going to happen with this video didn't end up happening. I didn't end up being able to reach out for outside help with either the script editing or the audio editing. So it was just a one-man show again this time. That was promise that I had made to patrons that I ended up, sort of breaking out of necessity. I decided that the greatest good would be just to get this video done before the end of the month, before another pay cycle went through, so that's what I did. This is the video as I've done it. I'm glad to have it done, and I hope it's up to everyone's standards, but I have a total refund policy if it isn't up to anybody's standards, if anybody wants a refund for the amount of time it took, or anything that they don't like about it. Anyway, I'd like to thank now, by name, the people who have given $10 a month or over. This entire career that I'm trying to launch pretty much rides on the backs of you fellas, and I definitely appreciate it. Anyway, folks like Cassie, Comfy Hat, Ron Gervais, Christian Zacharianson, Pat Hay, Soeb Sheik, Baldur Carlson, Will Hooten, Nick Cole-Hamilton, Jake Mays, Jake Brennan, Kevin DeBolt, Dalton Seiler, Dennis Clark, Ken Young, Niles D. McDonald, Alexander Leister, Nobody, Michael Benson, Kumaran Vajian, Justin Hughes, Igor Babiuk, Brian Hill, Andrew Steele, Jared Meyer, Andreas Larson, Kevin Schaub, White Zero, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Aaron Albach, Martin Markov, Alexander Dmitriev, Joe Hewison, Eden AK-47, Tim Moon, Brandon Boat, Kimmo Heikkinen, Ariel Badger Release, Jody Warren, Niels Bach-Frummer, Tizar Vicarian, Jeffrey Knutson, Paul Cocker, D. Kyle Braun, Will Wargrave, Galak, Sasha Aya, Jack Harvey, Jonas Martinson, Brad Wallace, Camel, Robert Glover, Jack Dawson, Alex Zalato, Josh, Matthew, Brad Carr, Dewey, Preston Allen, Stephen Potiuk, David Gilbreck, Brian Plockelman, Alexander Heavens, Devin Fitzpatrick, Matthew Zender, Trivium Art History, Jacob Robertson, Evan Hill, Pierce McBride, Evan Buccio, Stephen Premel, Connor Biblo, Andrew Schiffel, Chris Caon, Lee Jonas, Michael Atwell, Spyro Sedaris, David Carlson, Brad Smith, D. Stex, Rob Tackett, Angel-Headed Hipster, Daniel Mower Myrie, Colin, Joshua Vivi, Hay, Dylan Sibley, Yuri Pitness, Wesley M., Sharif Kazemi, Harley McAvoy, I Cannot Fly, Brett Gialmo, Colby Howard, David Reed, Divya Faust, Mary Ellen, Tim Marsh, Ryan Goods, Sangerston, David Fry, Morton Scanning, Cameron Jackson, Eddie Burton, Carl Gleason, Silas Blatchley Hansen, Josh Farkas, Ashley Rain, Martin Karsten, Michael Connor, Bob Belcher, and Chris Larkey, as well as the many others who contribute smaller amounts. Again, I really appreciate it. You make what I do possible, and thanks for watching.